So let's say that you're an artist. Specifically, you're a painter and you really like making paintings. You're really consistent with what you paint, so every single one of your paintings follows two specific criteria. The first one is that every single painting you make is a square, because squares are such a satisfyingly symmetrical shape, you just love them so much that you want every single painting you make to be a square. The second one is that every single one of your paintings is the exact same size, cause after all, you're an artist, which means you're probably broke, so to save money, you bought your canvases in bulk for a cheaper price with a big discount. Now, you've finally finished some of your paintings and you want to hang them up on your wall. Since all of your paintings are square, and you love squares so much, you want to hang your paintings in some sort of square formation, specifically so that every single painting fits inside one larger square. Once again though, you're a broke artist, which means the wall space in your room isn't particularly big, so with however many paintings you have, you want to fit them in the smallest space possible, to preserve as much room as you can for adding in new paintings when you finish them. Thankfully, your paintings are abstract art, so you can rotate them as much as you want, as long as you fit them all into the smallest square possible. Every time you finish a painting, you're going to hang it up on the wall with your other paintings, repeatedly rearranging them every single time so that they always fit in the smallest square possible. So what will that look like? Will it look neat and organized, or a mess of jumbled up shapes? When the number of paintings you've completed is a square number, obviously, the best way to hang them up in the smallest square possible is just that square, with zero extra room whatsoever. This includes numbers such as 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, etc, etc. Every other number of paintings in the smallest square arrangement will have some extra space somewhere. Whenever you hit a number of paintings that's one below a square number, such as 3, 8, 15, 24, etc., your smallest square will still be the same size as that square number, except with one empty square-shaped space. With these numbers, you've effectively created a slide puzzle out of your paintings, as you can shift that one empty space to be pretty much wherever you want. It's not actually only numbers that are one below squares that do this, but most numbers that are a little bit less than a square number, except instead of just one empty space to slide the paintings around, you get multiple. This includes numbers such as 7, 14, 23, 34, etc. with 2 empty squares, 13, 22, 33, etc. with 3 empty squares, yada yada, you get the gist. Then, there are certain numbers such as 6, 12, and 20, where you actually have an entire free row of empty space, free to shift paintings however you want, since you can't arrange them into any smaller square. With some of these slightly lower than square numbers, you have the freedom to rotate your paintings for the first time, although it's not necessary, since the solution is the same size either way. Most of the time, your arrangement of paintings will be in this sort of slide puzzle type format, where you have quite a bit of freedom to move your paintings around. Out of your first 100 arrangements of paintings, a grand total of 54 of the arrangements will follow this slide puzzle format, with 10 also being perfect squares. That makes 64 arrangements of paintings where you don't need to rotate any of your paintings at all. These remaining 36 numbers have some different arrangements. When you reach 5 paintings, you'll have to make this symmetrical arrangement with painting number 5 rotated 45 degrees in the middle of the other 4 paintings. This arrangement is entirely rigid and has no possible movement from any of the other squares. This sort of arrangement with paintings on the outside not rotated and paintings on the inside rotated 45 degrees is also your optimal solution with 28 paintings, 40 paintings, 65 paintings, and 89 paintings. Just like with 5 paintings, the arrangement with 40 paintings also has no possible movement from any of the paintings. However, the arrangement with 28 paintings actually does have some possible movement, with the outer ring of the central group all having the ability to be shifted around slightly. Additionally, if you only move the 4 corners in this group, you can actually place them to be no longer diagonal in the empty space there. However, this arrangement is rigid, so you can't slide them into that place. You'd have to take them off the wall and then put them back. The arrangements with 65 and 89 paintings also have some movement possible. However, instead of the corners of the inside squares, it's this cross section. If you move all of these paintings outwards as much as possible, you can actually rotate the central painting to any orientation you want. 3 more arrangements of paintings also follow a similar pattern of one group of paintings in the middle rotated by 45 degrees, being 26 paintings, 82 paintings, and 85 paintings. Except for these 3, that group is not centered on the board, and is instead shifted off to one direction just a bit. All of these arrangements also allow for a little bit of movement. The optimal arrangement for 82 in fact follows the same pattern as 65 and 89, with this cross being able to be moved out, allowing this central square to be rotated. 26 paintings and 85 paintings do not have this ability, but they still have little movements that can be made with many of the paintings. When you hit 10 paintings, the optimal solution also involves one square in the middle rotated by 45 degrees, but with 10 paintings you can also rearrange it into a different configuration so that there's 2 squares in the middle, the first instance of 45-degree rotated paintings in the middle not also forming a square themselves. You can also add these outer 2 since they have quite a lot of extra space. This pattern is also your best solution when you have 27, 38, 52, 67, and 84 paintings. 27, 38, 67, and 84 paintings also allow the movement of these outer two paintings to be rotated and join the long line, but 52, while not completely rigid, doesn't have the space. If you don't like the line of diagonal squares, all 5 of these numbers also have alternate solutions that only involve 2 or 3 paintings diagonally rotated, in which those diagonal paintings are surrounded by 4 upright paintings, effectively making numerous copies of the optimal square with only 5 paintings. Either one works, and they both have the same size for their outer squares. The solution when you reach 66 paintings is similar, but instead of the middle group of squares forming another square, or a singular line of squares, the middle group is a 3x8 grouping of squares, which in fact has quite a bit of free movement, as this entire section can slide back and forth, but only slightly. These 15 numbers only require you to rotate some of your paintings 45 degrees, but these remaining 21 numbers of paintings require you to rotate some of your paintings into some more complex arrangements. When you reach 18 paintings, you'll still have a fairly similar arrangement, with outer paintings being orthogonal and middle paintings being diagonal, except this time your group of middle paintings won't form a square or rectangle. I like to call this the hexagonal packing, because if you take this middle section and extend this pattern outwards, each painting will border 6 other paintings. You'll have a similar pattern when you reach 68 paintings, except this time with a much bigger blob of central cells. Both of these solutions also allow for minimal movement of a couple of paintings, usually the ones at the ends of the hexagonal sections, but sometimes some of the middle paintings have a tiny bit of movement possible as well. When you reach 86 paintings, your strategy will partly be the hexagonal packing, but not always, with these 2x2 groups of 4 paintings separating out the hexagonal sections. This one also allows for some movement of paintings, mostly on the ends, but also these 2 in the middle have the tiniest amount of room possible to move up and down, so tiny that we actually have to zoom in a lot to properly see it. With 41 and 71 paintings, you'll still be employing the hexagonal packing method, except if you zoom in closer, you'll see that these hexagons are a little bit off-center compared to the other 3 where they were pretty much spot on. But hey, you don't really care about that. All you really care about is fitting your paintings into the smallest square possible, so anything goes. Some of the paintings in these 2 solutions have quite a bit of movement possible, particularly these 2, which can slide pretty far out of their respective slots. Anyways, these 5 numbers also had fairly easy to understand solutions. But unfortunately, we've officially hit the point where we just have to completely jump off the deep end with these remaining 16 arrangements of paintings. What does that mean, you may ask? Well, let's just say when you try to put your paintings into these remaining 16 arrangements, you're not going to have a good time. Everything from here on out ranges from stressful to absolutely diabolical. When you reach 11 paintings, your arrangement will look like this. It seems somewhat similar to some of our previous solutions, with a section of squares in the middle rotated 45 degrees, except these are not rotated exactly 45 degrees. Not only are they not exactly rotated 45 degrees, but they also don't all connect together nicely. Look at this tiny gap in the middle. It's not even the only tiny gap, as the upper tilted painting also has a similar gap. Then the rightmost corner of the rightmost painting in the rotated middle square also ever so slightly peaks in between these other 2 paintings, separating them from each other. With this arrangement, none of these paintings have any room to move around whatsoever. Something similar happens when you reach 19 paintings, except this one instead has 2 separate groups, separated only by a sliver of space, and within each group, the paintings are not perfectly aligned. While this arrangement may look rather chaotic, if we shift our perspective, it's actually perfectly symmetrical on the diagonal, and we get an oddly shaped outline of an arrow right in the middle. When you hit 17 paintings, you get this demonic arrangement with even more tiny gaps spattered around here and there. This again seems somewhat similar to the 45-degree rotation solutions, but these paintings certainly aren't rotated 45 degrees. There's also this one painting over here that's not even the same angle of rotation as any of the other paintings, marking the first example of an optimal solution having squares of 3 different rotations. It's certainly not going to be the last one either. Once you reach 29 paintings completed, things start to get even more odd. You've got these upright paintings, and then a couple of paintings down here that appear to be using the hexagonal packing formation, but then it Things have gotten a little bit messed up in the middle, with way too many weird gaps and slight rotations to count. Remember how the arrangement of 17 paintings was the first with 3 different rotations of paintings? Well, with 29, that jumps up to a ridiculous 5 different rotations, which is crazy. This arrangement, which appears to be similar to the hexagonal packing formation, is present in the solution when you have 51 paintings as well, and while this arrangement appears to be significantly more chaotic, due to having such a high number of small gaps, the middle section here is actually rotationally symmetric. This entire solution is actually rotationally symmetric, if you discount this column of squares at least. There's also only 3 different rotations here, compared to the ridiculousness of 29's 5 rotations, as these 2 outer columns are at the same rotation. Even though I said this wasn't as chaotic, there are still some odd shenanigans happening if you inspect it really close up. Let's take a closer look at these 2 rows. They sort of look aligned here, but in actuality, when we inspect the upper left corners of the right column paintings, 2 of them touch the left column's corners, while the other 2 come just barely short. This indicates that while these lengths all appear to be identical, there are some incredibly minor, barely noticeable differences between them. Yeah, good luck putting up this arrangement of paintings on a wall. Ending out the arrangements that appear to follow the hexagonal pattern, but don't quite, we have 55 paintings, which just like 29, appears to be kind of nice, then has some smaller gaps in the middle, and then just completely falls apart on the left side. Out of all of the arrangements we've seen so far, this one has the absolute tiniest cracks and slivers of space. In particular, this one over here is so small that my graphics don't even show it properly. This one also has easily the most different rotations out of all of the arrangements we've seen so far, to the point that I can't even be sure how many there are. I want to say that there are 8, but there may be even more considering how incredibly slight these differences are. When you hit 37 paintings, you again have an arrangement which appears to be similar to the previous 45-degree rotation strategy, but also has a handful of minor inconsistencies, including 4 different rotations of paintings. The good thing about this one though is that even though it looks messy, just like the arrangement with 19 paintings, it's actually symmetrical on the diagonal. It's also the first arrangement of paintings that has some more smaller squares within the arrangement, with these 2 little baby squares formed in the space between these 2 groups of 4 paintings. This one also has quite a few paintings with room to move around. When you reach 50 paintings, you'll actually have an exactly identical arrangement as 37 paintings, except with an extra row and column of paintings attached to the edge. Oddly enough, 37 and 50 paintings are the only 2 numbers to follow this pattern. When you reach 53 paintings, you'll get this arrangement, which is oh so close to the partly hexagonal packing arrangement we saw with 86 paintings, but with 1 pair of paintings at the top that are rotated around a little bit to preserve some extra space. 69 paintings holds a somewhat similar pattern, except none of the pairs are aligned whatsoever, whereas at least 53 had one 2x2 group of paintings in the middle. 69 also has 4 rotations instead of 53's 3, with 1 small sliver right at the top here, and 1 even tinier sliver of a difference just a little bit below it. Even though on a glance, this one looks pretty easy to understand, there's actually no cohesion whatsoever in the middle section. All of these heights are completely different and follow no sensible pattern. Finally, 87 is the last arrangement to follow a similar pattern as these 2, and it's better in some ways, but worse in other ways. In the bottom section, we actually do have perfect consistency, as this group of 12 paintings is exactly identical to this orientation within the 53 painting solution, perfect spacing and heights between the 2. However, this upper section of 8 paintings is contrastingly catastrophic. Actually, maybe it's not that bad. After all, there are only 3 different rotations here, as these 2 match the non-messy group, and these other 6 are all the same rotation, but still, the spaces between these 8 paintings are messy, messy, messy. Either way, you're not going to have a fun time putting these paintings up. You're probably also not going to have a fun time when you reach 70 paintings, which brings back tiny gaps in full force all around the entire arrangement. At least 8 of these gaps are exactly identical, as these 2 groups of 9 paintings have equal spacing, and are not only rotationally symmetric within themselves, but with each other too. These 6 in the middle unfortunately are a slightly different pattern, but hey, at least these middle 2 paintings have a bit of room to move around. Actually, this arrangement, despite all the tiny gaps, does have perfect 180-degree rotational symmetry, which makes it at least a little bit less chaotic than some of the others. Another arrangement with perfect 180-degree rotational symmetry, despite looking messy as hell, is the arrangement when you reach 54 paintings. This one has 2 separate pairs of 4 paintings in an almost 2x2 formation, 1 pair which contains a gap in the center and 1 pair which does not. There's also a gap in the middle, one of the only times the middle group can be 2 separate groups that don't connect, but you do have enough room to push these 2 squares to connect if you so wanted to. This arrangement is also quite interesting because all of these 16 paintings in the center are the same rotation, putting us back down to 2, which is something we haven't seen in a while. We only have 3 remaining arrangements to talk about. When you reach 39 paintings, you'll be arranging them in this formation, which upon first glance looks messy, but it's actually very symmetrical. There's also only 3 different rotations for the paintings, and they're all pretty easy to tell apart. This is also the first arrangement in a while that doesn't have any ridiculously small gaps between paintings. Yay! When you reach 83 paintings, you get this particularly intricate pattern. This 3x3 group of paintings is repeated twice, and 8/9 of a third time over here with these 8 with just this upper left painting forced to be pushed upwards a bit. The upper right of this arrangement also bears a striking resemblance to our arrangement of 17 paintings, with this one painting peeking in between these other 2, and this final painting rotated slightly differently, making this arrangement have 3 different rotations. Then finally, when you reach 88 paintings, you'll get this arrangement, potentially the most diabolical of them all, despite being perfectly symmetrical. From a quick glance, it seems similar to our 45-degree rotated ones, except what the hell is this? These center 10 paintings are all slightly rotated compared to each other, and the outer groups of 6 paintings. They don't even follow a sensible pattern either, as there are a total of 5 different rotations of paintings in this middle section, each one ever so slightly different from each other, bringing the total up to 6 in this arrangement. Truly one of the most demonic arrangements that you'll have to put up on your wall. Thankfully, you haven't started painting yet, so you're not going to have to deal with the diabolical arrangements at this moment, but you still want to plan ahead, just to know what to prepare for, so you decide to make this chart for your ease of reference, categorizing them into a number of different categories. The red numbers are your happy numbers. You'll have a wonderfully easy time putting up your paintings into a perfect square. You'll have a similar time with the orange numbers, as you'll have a functioning slide puzzle right on your wall. Or, well, not a functioning slide puzzle, since you're using tape and sticky tack, but visually it'll look like one. On the other hand, whenever you hit a cyan number, oof. Better make sure you're in a good headspace when you make that painting, because you sure won't be when you try to arrange all of your paintings on your wall. Now, obviously, you made a square grid to look at this data, because as we've been over, you just absolutely love squares. But there's something interesting about this data. A pattern you can pick out. All it requires is for you to shift your perspective just a little bit. That's better. Interestingly, with every square number you go up, you get one more addition to the streak of slide puzzle arrangements, creating the perfect pattern on the right side, with a wall separating the slide puzzle arrangements from the more complicated arrangements. The left side, on the other hand, seems to have no distinguishable patterns at all, at least with this arrangement of numbers and these specific categories. You don't know for sure though. After all, you're no mathematician, you're just an artist who wants to make paintings and arrange them in a very specific way. But maybe they do have patterns at higher numbers. What happens when we go over 100 paintings? Well, unfortunately, you run out of wall space. You can't fit 101 paintings on your wall in a square anymore. You'll have to figure out something else to do with your paintings. So, stop being an artist for now, and instead become a mathematician, or someone who has a passing interest in mathematics, and look upwards at many of the larger square formations. Let's extend this chart 8 rows downwards. While we were only looking at solutions under 100, we couldn't pick out very many patterns in this region. When we extend it to 324, we do see some sort of patterns emerge. Solutions that only require 45-degree rotations are particularly dominant in this left section. However, there appears to be an exception in that group, being this odd streak of numbers. Then, closer to the middle, we have a grouping of more chaotic solutions. This group in fact begins to eat away at the previously impenetrable wall of slide puzzle solutions. There are even more patterns to be found. However, to see them, we must subdivide these groups even further. Our yellow group here are solutions that only involve rotating squares by 45 degrees. But in some cases, these middle sections form squares themselves, while in other cases they form rectangles. If we highlight all of the ones which only involve squares, we get... not as consistent as I would have hoped, although there does appear to be a line on the far left side of numbers, one more than a perfect square, with exceptions 170 and 257. Maybe there's more consistency with symmetry? When we separate this category again into 2 categories, one where the central square is perfectly centered, and one where the central square is off-center, we get even less consistency, it seems. Now let's go the exact opposite direction. Let's instead separate the solutions that involve one singular line of diagonally rotated squares. Wow, this on the other hand gives us a significantly more consistent pattern. A line that starts at 10 and goes down almost without faltering and without appearing anywhere else on the board. Another pattern we can search for is looking for when this pattern appears. As we saw with the solution of 86, this sort of hexagonal packing pattern with several pairs of squares. That once again gives us another line, but a much thicker one. Not all of these follow this pattern perfectly though. For instance, we saw that 69 had 2 gaps up here and 87 had quite a mess here. We can split them up based on those that make the pattern perfectly, with only 1 rotation of squares in the center group, and ones that fall apart with 2 or more rotations. That splits this pattern up into 2 distinct lines that border each other, with slightly heavier emphasis on the imperfect patterns. Another strategy that we saw, starting at 88, is the one that, from afar, seems to mimic the 45-degree rotation strategy, except many of these columns are very slightly rotated from each other. As it turns out, quite a lot of other numbers above 100 do that strategy as well. Graphing them out, we have what is maybe the most fascinating pattern yet. This perfectly includes this line that goes through the actual 45-degree rotated solutions, but it also includes another, much less consistent line over here, right next to the other line we just talked about. Finally, the last strategy I have to talk about starts at 132, which is the very first number to break our perfect wall of slide puzzles. With this, we get our hexagonal packing strategy again, except this time it's in two separate groups, with one getting a little bit messed up around the edges. This strategy is the optimal solution for every single number that eats into the wall of slide puzzles, and a couple more as well, all of which are packed neatly into one group. We can also split these ones into ones that contain symmetry and ones that don't. This separation is rather interesting, as instead it's the smaller numbers that tend to not have symmetry, and the bigger numbers that do tend to have symmetry. Does that pattern continue down the board, extending past 324? Well, unfortunately for us, this concept still remains as an open problem, continuing to be worked on, with solutions being found and improvements still being made. Right now, we don't know how far these patterns continue, or if there are other patterns to be found in larger numbers. In fact, many of the patterns covered in this video could also not be optimal, as many of these have not been definitively confirmed, so it's very likely better solutions and patterns could be found in the future. This video will very likely be out of date in a year from now, as many of the solutions you saw here were only found in the past year as well. So, while this video must end here, I am hopeful that we'll see more progress on this specific sector of mathematics sometime soon. For now, we can still bask in the glory of the satisfying solutions, the odd solutions, and everything in between. You, on the other hand, can bask in the glory of being able to put all of your paintings on your wall in the smallest square possible that humankind is currently aware of. Thanks for watching!